Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 2 for PPA 500. Hope you had a good weekend. I hope your week is off to a good start. So as we begin week 2, let me thank you first for your submission of your first graded Canvas essays. I've gone through and reviewed all those essays and read them. I've provided some feedback for you. Overall, I think everyone did a great job on the essays. I thought they were cogent. I thought they were insightful. I thought everyone did a really nice job of not only analyzing Madison's argument in Federalist Paper number 10, but also then bringing that into bear on contemporary society and talking about what Madison's argument means for the factions that we currently see in our current system. And so I think everyone did very well. So just continue doing that in your future Canvas essays, and you'll continue to get very high scores on those essays. I did see some trends in the responses. I think there were some really good points that were made. One trend I saw was a discussion of social media and how the rise of social media has had an impact upon factionalization, if you want to use that word, the growth of factions, and especially has had an impact upon the differences of opinions that we see in factions, and kind of pushing factions apart and toward the more extreme ideological ends of the spectrum. And I think it's very true. There's a famous political scientist, Theodore Lowy, and Lowy made the argument that our system of government is really what we consider to be a marketplace of ideas, and that it really is a marketplace whereby people can exchange ideas, share ideas, learn other ideas, and we have a lot of avenues for that participation, for that sharing of ideas. And social media certainly do provide us with additional avenues for the sharing of those types of opinions. The problem, obviously, in social media is it's kind of similar to, in a marketplace, if you go and you purchase a car at a car dealership and it's a new car, you're going to get a warranty with that new car. If it's a certified used car, you're going to get a warranty with that certified used car. If you go and you purchase a used car from a used car marketplace, or one of these used car flea markets we see popping up all over the place, you're not going to get a warranty with it. It may not be that reliable of a car, and you really don't know. You have to really do your homework on that car and find out its maintenance records and all those types of things. And so how we acquire things, it depends on where we get them. It depends on how much information we have to truly vet the quality of what we are getting in this marketplace of ideas. And sometimes it's difficult to vet the quality and the credibility and the veracity of a lot of these opinions that are being exchanged in social media types of outlets. Now, in the past, the federal government did a lot of regulation when it came to something like the news that was being covered by major news outlets, or if you had opinion shows with major news outlets. The FCC had principles such as the limitations on the number of outlets that could be owned by one owner, and so a limitation on media conglomerates. Now, they've certainly loosened that up recently, and so we see a lot of media conglomerates today. But in the past, they were able to regulate that aspect of the media. They were able to regulate things such as equal time. And so they would require that if you're giving time to one candidate, you have to offer equal time to another candidate. If you're giving time to one political party, you have to give equal time to another political party. Then they also had what they call the fairness doctrine, whereby they could require that these outlets would provide fair coverage to both sides of the issue and to both candidates and to both political parties. Now, the fairness doctrine went away several years ago, but the FCC still has the ability to regulate traditional media, and the nexus for that regulation is the use of public airwaves. And so since these media are using public airwaves, the public own the airwaves, and so therefore there is a reason, or there is a justification for federal government regulation of how these issues are discussed and how the news will be covered by these news outlets. Now, the problem with social media, obviously, is that you don't have social media necessarily using public airwaves. You have social media using the internet, and people typically gain access to the internet through paying a fee. And so you'll have an internet service provider, you'll pay a fee to the internet service provider, and they will then give you access to the internet. In the old days with public airways, if you had a television and you could put the rabbit ears up on your television, you could get the transmission from whatever city is close to you, and it was really very public in nature. So there's less of that nexus for regulation with social media than what we had with traditional media many years ago. And so it becomes very difficult for government to regulate the veracity and the credibility of a lot of the opinions that are shared on social media. And we also know that people tend to build up these perceptual screens, whereby they tend to gravitate toward information that helps substantiate their a priori opinions and ideas. If they are confronted with information that runs counter to something that they already believe, chances are they will discount that. They will try and move away from that information and again congregate toward information that supports what they believe and fits within their perceptual screen. And I think that's why you see some viewers will certainly gravitate toward conservative social media platforms as compared to liberals who gravitate to liberal outlets and platforms. Some people gravitate toward Fox News and Newsmax, or others gravitate toward MSNBC. And so I think you have that self-selection that certainly goes on, and that self-selection will just harden opinions on each side of the political spectrum. And so I think the discussion of social media is very appropriate. As social media continues to grow, we have more and more questions about, can we regulate it? Should we regulate it? And if so, what are some of the methods for regulating social media? And that's why you see, Facebook and all these other social media sites are being called into Congress to testify before Congress as Congress tries to wrap its arms around social media and how to try and regulate some of these things going on in social media. I thought another interesting trend that I tend to see in these posts was the discussion again about how we tend to see more of a difference between the factions, and that factions don't overlap nearly as much now as perhaps they may have overlapped in the past. And on a few of the feedback boxes, I provided some feedback in terms of the impact of political gerrymandering. And so from a structural perspective, political gerrymandering has also contributed to this idea of making it difficult to find middle ground between the two ideological extremes. And so you're probably familiar with the idea of political gerrymandering. Political gerrymandering is when political parties in the state legislature will draw congressional districts, House districts, as well as state legislative districts to benefit their political parties. And so when they do this political gerrymandering, we end up getting some really strange looking districts. And when they do this political gerrymandering and draw off these very strange looking districts, there are two strategies that they typically use in political gerrymandering. There's what's called packing and what's called cracking. In the packing approach, if, say, for instance, you had a state legislature that was dominated by the Democratic Party, they would look at their map and they would look at where Democrats and Republicans live on that map, and especially the likely Democratic and Republican voters. And then in a packing strategy, they will try and draw one district that's going to be heavily Republican and try and pack as many Republicans into that one district as possible. And then write that district off as, okay, we're giving up on that district. That's going to be a Republican district. But by doing that, we're diluting the number of Republicans in all the other districts so that there are more Democrats and Republicans in all these other districts. So we have a much better chance of winning all these districts by giving up this one Republican district. The opposite of packing is obviously cracking. And in cracking, what you do is you look, if you have we'll say if you have a Republican controlled state legislature, they'll take a look and they have a Democratic stronghold. They will break that stronghold up into numerous different districts. So put a little bit into this district, a little bit into this district, a little bit into this district. And by doing so, then they have diluted the number of Democrats in each one of these districts, thereby making it more likely that Republicans will win those districts. So through packing and cracking, this political gerrymandering process, we have created structurally some very safe districts in both the House of Representatives as well as in state legislatures. And by creating these safe districts, members, the representatives in those districts, they don't need to worry very much at all about the general election, Because if I'm a Republican and this is a very Republican district, I know that I'm going to have token Democratic opposition in the general election. So I don't really care much about appealing to Democrats. I need to appeal to Republicans. And I need to appeal to the Republicans who are most likely to vote in a primary election. Because I'm probably going to see, if I'm going to see any competition at all, my competition is probably going to be coming from the right side of the ideological spectrum. And if I'm a Democrat, it's going to be coming from the left side of the ideological spectrum. So I better appeal to the more conservative element of the Republican Party, or from a Democrat, the more liberal element of the Democratic Party, in order to survive that primary election. Because once I survive that primary election in a safe district, I'm golden. And I know I'm going to win the general election. And so what that has done is it has moved Republicans to the right and moved Democrats to the left. It has hollowed out the middle ground. And that middle ground is usually where we end up coming up with our bipartisan legislation and coming up with our negotiated settlements. So I think that has also hardened opinions on both the right as well as the left, and made it more difficult for us to find room for agreement. That's one of the reasons why it's so incredibly difficult in Congress to get a budget done on time. We very rarely get a budget done on time, and when we do get a budget done, even though it's not going to be on time, it probably is not going to be in balance either. If you look back to 1969, and every year since 1969, we are now in 2023, in every single year, we have run a budget deficit with the exception of only 2 years. And that's because it's very difficult for us to come to agreement on tax increases or spending decreases that will allow us to try and eliminate the deficit. So I think that's a structural argument as well for why we tend to have these big differences in terms of our factions, at least in terms of political ideologies on the left versus on the right. Now, one way to try and mitigate those concerns is obviously to have a bipartisan or a nonpartisan redistricting commission. And some states do have redistricting commissions. We have one of those here in the state of California. And if you can at least remove part of the gerrymandering process away from your state legislatures, and you put the district boundary drawing process into the hands of your nonpartisan or bipartisan redistricting commission, you can have a little bit of a check on some of the practices of this political gerrymandering. But again, I think that's a structural argument for why we tend to see these big factional differences, especially in terms of political ideology. I don't want to go on and on that for too long, but I just want to again compliment you on your essays in Canvas number 1. I think everyone did a really nice job. For next week, you have Canvas number 2. And Canvas number 2, the prompt asks you to select 3 out of the 8 principles in the American Society for Public Administration Code of Conduct, and discuss 3 of those principles that you think could be difficult for either you in your position or could be difficult for your organization to implement. And we will cover those 8 principles tonight. I also have a breakout group exercise at the end of our session tonight, whereby you'll also deal with those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct. But that will be your Canvas essay number 2 prompt. And then also next week, on the 12th, you have do your initial skills self-assessment. And I've received a couple of those initial skills self-assessments so far. Again, they're being graded on a credit, no credit basis. So you turn it in, you get the 10 points. There are no right or wrong answers. Just in that first part of the skills assessment, you just on an ordinal ranking of 1 to 5, give us an indication of how much experience you have or how much knowledge you have in these different areas of the program. Then in section 2, we break it down to budgeting, human resource management, organization theory, policy analysis, and the research methods, program evaluation. And for each of those, just give us a sentence or 2 about what your experience is in each of those 5 core content areas. And then in the third and final part, just a brief paragraph about why you are pursuing the MPA degree, what types of skills you want to obtain through your time in the MPA program. So again, that's due, as well as Canvas essay number 2, and then the 2 responses to classmates that go along with Canvas essay 2. And both of those things are then due on March the 12th. Now, moving forward, where we are at tonight, last week we finished up a lot of our foundational information on American government, kind of providing this environment of American government, whereby public administration occurs within. Since public administration happens in public organizations, and these public organizations are located within political institutions, it was important for us to have this general kind of basic knowledge about American government, where our Constitution came from, and some of the influences that affected the content of our Constitution. Where I would like to start tonight is to talk about the Constitution, go through the federal Constitution, all 7 articles and 27 amendments, hit the highlights. Obviously, we can't go through all the details. I mean, there are standalone courses on the US Constitution. So we'll have about 45 minutes to an hour tonight where we can go through the Constitution, hit the highlights of the 7 articles and 27 amendments, and then draw comparisons where we can with the state of California Constitution. Whereas the federal Constitution has 7 articles and 27 amendments, the state of California Constitution has 35 articles and has been amended well over 500 times. And so it's far beyond our scope in this class to go through with a fine-tooth comb all the different aspects of the California Constitution. I do think it's important for us to draw similarities and differences between the federal Constitution and the California Constitution as we go through this discussion tonight. So I'll be doing that along the way. Also, as we talk about the Constitution, we will be highlighting a couple of other things. We will highlight the compromises in the Constitution. If you remember last week, we talked at the Constitutional Convention, you had 3 main conflicts going on at the Constitutional Convention. You had the conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. You had the conflict between large states and small states, and you had the conflict between slave states and non-slave states. And those 3 conflicts all manifested themselves in a series of compromises within the Constitution. And we will highlight those compromises as we go through the Constitution. And then we will also highlight the big so what question. Well, so what? Why are we covering the Constitution as public administrators? And why is it important for us as public administrators? And what is our role in terms of implementing these provisions from the Constitution and protecting individuals' constitutional rights? So that's kind of our goal in the first part of class tonight. Once we finish with the Constitution, we'll then take a brief break. When we come back, we'll then talk about accountability and ethics in the public sector. We'll talk about some of the reasons why accountability is difficult in the public sector. We'll talk about different approaches to accountability and different things we hold people accountable for. We will talk about ways in which we can make accountability and ethics easier to do in the public sector. I'll introduce you to the ASPA Code of Conduct, and we'll go through those 8 principles. We'll then talk about some of the transparency measures we have here in the state of California in order to try and enhance ethical adherence, not only on the part of public administrators, but also on the part of decision makers, elected officials. And then we'll wrap it all up with some breakout groups, and we'll get together in breakout groups, and we have an exercise for you in terms of sharing out some experiences that you've had in your organizations with some ethical dilemmas that you may have faced or have been faced by your organization. So that's what tonight looks like. Moving forward into next week, then our topic for next week will be public and private differences. And I have one classics article assigned for you next week. That's the Graham Allison article, looking at public and private sectors and asking the question, are they fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects? Next week, we will use the Graham Allison article to inform our discussion of the primary differences between public sector organizations and private sector organizations, to underscore why we study public administration differently than how private administration is oftentimes studied in an MBA as opposed to an MPA program. Okay, so that's where we are. That's where we are going then for next week. Any questions at all before we start to delve into the Constitution? Okay. Let's go ahead then and jump in. I'm going to try and keep this as brief as I can. Again, hit the highlights, but not to spend a whole lot of time going through every single part of the Constitution. Again, there is so much here. so much in terms of the interpretation of a lot of these parts of the Constitution that you literally have entire courses. You go to law school, you'll have an entire course in constitutional law. In fact, you'll probably have two of them. You have Con Law 1 and Con Law 2. It's even too much to do just in one course in law school. It's a lot of information. I think we're all familiar with the preamble to the Constitution, but let's jump into our articles. The Constitution, hopefully everyone is seeing the Constitution. Are you seeing it? Oh, you went to zoom in on the screen. Yeah, let me see if let me move some stuff around here. Okay, is that a little bit better? Hopefully you can see that a little better, maybe a little bigger for you. Again, it's a very well-organized document. Okay, good. It's a very well-organized document. Each article speaks to a different general topic. Now, there are some topics, some articles that have multiple topics kind of mixed into them, but it's pretty well organized, different articles for different topics. Article 1 deals with the legislative branch. Now, a lot of political scientists will make the argument that Congress is the first branch of government. We know separation of powers is a horizontal balancing of power between legislative, executive, and judicial. And it's true that Congress is spoken of first in this first article to the Constitution. Also, Article 1 is by far the longest and most detailed article in the entire Constitution. And all the articles after Article 1 get shorter and do not have quite the specificity to what we see the framers give in Article 1 of the Constitution. So because it comes first, and because it is the most specific, a lot of political scientists will argue that Congress is the quote-unquote first branch of government. I would tend to agree with that. One of my subfields of my PhD was Congress, and so that was one of my comprehensive exam areas. I do believe that Congress probably was where the framers placed a lot of their attention, and for obvious reasons. So we know that one of the major compromises we have to deal with the large state versus small state conflict at the Constitutional Convention is this creation of a bicameral Congress. We talked about the large state plan, the Virginia plan versus a small state plan, the New Jersey plan. Virginia plan, proportional representation, New Jersey plan, equal representation. So here we're going to create a two-house Congress, we're going to create a House of Representatives, and we are going to create a U.S. Senate. Section 2 talks specifically about the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives was designed to be the body closer to the people. And so in order to make it closer to the people, it was designed with members having 2-year terms, and so very short terms in the House of Representatives, because the framers wanted these members of the House to be accountable to the public. They're popularly elected every 2 years. And what that means is that if you're being elected every 2 years, from the moment that you are elected to the House of Representatives, you immediately begin fundraising and running for re-election. It's just a nonstop process. You are constantly raising money if you serve in the House of Representatives and you want to be re-elected. So 2-year terms, elected through popular election, through proportional representation. So based upon population, larger states have more representatives in the House than smaller states. You have to be at least 25 years old to be elected to serve in the House of Representatives. You must be a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years, and you must live in the state from which you are to be chosen. Now, when you are running for the office, you don't necessarily have to live in your district when you are running for the office, but once you are elected and begin to serve, then you need to be a resident of that state. In Article 1, Section 2, we also have this clause about direct taxation being apportioned. So representation is apportioned according to population, but direct taxation had to be apportioned according to population as well. That's something that was changed later on with the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. And then we have this other compromise, which obviously is a horrendous compromise, but a compromise known as the 3/5 compromise, that for the purposes of representation, enslaved people will be counted as 3/5 of other persons for the purpose of representation in the House of Representatives. Obviously, fortunately, that was done away with the 14th Amendment. with one person and one vote, but the 3/5 compromise was something that was a compromise between slave states and non-slave states. Well, how do we know how many people different states have? Well, we know that through doing an actual enumeration of population every 10 years. And so every 10 years, we will do an actual enumeration of the population in order to use that for the basis of representation in the House of Representatives. If there's a vacancy in the House, then the executive authority in that state has the ability to fill that vacancy. And obviously that would be the governor in all of our states. And then there is one official position, one office that is listed in the Constitution with the House of Representatives, and that obviously is Speaker of the House. So we all know Kevin McCarthy from California is the current Speaker of the House. If you watch the Speaker election back in January, you saw it took, I believe it was 15 ballots, 15 different votes before Kevin McCarthy was eventually elected Speaker. But that is the only constitutional office in the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House position also then serves as the essentially second in line after the Vice President for succession into the presidency. So it goes President, then Vice President, then Speaker of the House, and then what we call President Pro Tem of the US Senate. It's also very important to note, and we've all lived through this in the last administration twice, is that the House of Representatives also has the sole power of impeachment. So the House of Representatives has the sole ability to pass articles of impeachment. The House of Representatives did that twice. The democratically controlled House did that twice with former President Trump. It can be done with a simple majority vote. So it is relatively easy for these articles of impeachment to be passed because it's only a simple majority. And if you have a very highly politically charged situation, the party in power is different than the president's party. Lately has really increased the specter of the possibility of having articles of impeachment pass. And typically what will happen is articles of impeachment have to be discussed within committee, then they get reported out of committee to the floor of the House, then they're debated on the floor of the House, and then eventually a vote is held. And if you get a simple majority, then those articles of impeachment are reported out and they are then sent to the US Senate. Then Section 3 talks about this US Senate. So US Senate is the upper chamber. So US Senate was designed to be from the people. And so you have members of the Senate, you have equal representation. This is your New Jersey plan. Oops, sorry. This is your New Jersey plan. Let me use my arrow instead. And so you have equal representation. So you have 2 senators from each state, irrespective of the population of that state. They serve much longer terms. They serve 6-year terms, and every senator has 1 vote. The Senate is divided up into thirds for the purposes of re-election, so that only 1/3 of the Senate will come up for re-election every 2 years. And so you get this, you won't have the entire Senate overturning in a 6-year period. In that 6th year, you have 1/3 coming up every 2 years. The members of the US Senate were not popularly elected. They were selected by state legislatures. And so state legislatures did an indirect selection of members of the US Senate. And again, that was there for a couple of reasons. One reason was this inherent kind of distrust in average citizens. If the average ordinary citizens are, at that time, average ordinary citizens were white male property owners, but if they were being entrusted with putting people in the House of Representatives, then we had to have kind of a check on who serves in this upper chamber, these very long 6-year terms. And so it would be the state legislatures that would select those members of the Senate. Also, this was a nod to the anti-federalists, because by giving the states the ability to select their members of the US Senate, you are catering to states' rights. And you are saying this is a power of state governments. We're not giving it over to the people. State governments are going to retain this power. So it's very much of a nod to the anti-federalists who fear too strong of a national government. You have to be older than to be in the US House. You have to be at least 30 years old. You have to be a citizen in the US for 9 years. And again, be an inhabitant of the state from where you are being chosen. The Vice President of the United States serves as the President of the Senate, but only votes in the case of a tie. I think we're all familiar with that. And we've seen Vice President Harris going over to the Senate and voting a couple times in the case of a tie. A couple times she went over there and didn't have to vote because it wasn't a tie, but only votes in case of a tie. The Senate also gets to choose its own officers, and the one constitutional position outside the Vice President for the Senate is the President pro tem. The President pro tem is in line for the presidency right after the Speaker of the House. The President pro tem of the Senate currently is Patty Murray from the state of Washington. It usually goes to the longest serving member of the majority party. The longest serving member of the majority party since Pat Leahy retired from the Senate would be Dianne Feinstein, but since Dianne Feinstein has signaled that she's not going to be seeking re-election, she declined to become President pro tem, and so it then went to Patty Murray. Whereas the House has the power to pass articles of impeachment, the Senate has the ability to try those articles of impeachment. So they have the sole power to try all impeachments. And again, we watched that in the Trump administration twice. And when that occurs, each member of the Senate must take an oath. And then after they take their oath, then the trial is presided over by the Chief Justice for the Supreme Court. So John Roberts came over and presided over the both trials of President Trump at that time, former President Trump, in both of those impeachment trials. In both of those impeachment trials, President Trump was acquitted and was not removed from office. Prior to that, we had Bill Clinton, who also was subject to an impeachment trial. Likewise, he was not convicted on articles of impeachment and remained in office. Andrew Johnson was another president who faced impeachment and faced an impeachment trial. For Andrew Johnson, his impeachment trial, the vote was much closer. That Johnson survived removal from office and conviction on impeachment by one vote, literally one vote. And the situation back in the 1860s was the Republicans who controlled Congress felt that Andrew Johnson was being too soft on the southern states through Reconstruction. So therefore, they passed a law, which is dubious constitutionality, but passed the law as a trap, knowing that Johnson would not follow that law. And when Johnson didn't follow that law, then they impeached him on not following that law of Congress. But it really was a pretty effective trap they set up for Johnson, and then were almost able to remove him from office. Presidents aren't the only ones who can be impeached and removed from office. Other federal officers can as well. And Congress has removed some judges, some federal judges from office through the impeachment process. It's just we've never removed a president through impeachment. Richard Nixon was facing impeachment, but resigned before impeachment happened and before an impeachment trial could ever get going. And so Nixon resigned. He was never officially impeached and removed from office. Whereas it's only a simple majority in the House of Representatives to pass articles of impeachment, it requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate in order to find a president guilty to convict them of these articles of impeachment. So it's much more difficult to actually find a president guilty of these articles of impeachment and then remove them from office. When you do have impeachment, and if someone is convicted on these articles of impeachment, it shall not extend further than removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. This was a big discussion back in President Trump's impeachments. Can you separate those? Is this a divisible thing? Removal from office and disqualification to hold any other office in the future. Now, in the past, the parliamentarian in Congress has made a couple of conflicting decisions about that. At times, the parliamentarian said those two things are conjoined to each other. And so if you do find someone guilty and they're removed from office, then you also have to disqualify them from holding future office. However, at other times, Congress has not done that. They have removed people from office, but then they have neglected to disqualify them from future office. And so this is kind of an unanswered constitutional question. Are those two terms divisible? In some instances, they have been. In other instances, the parliamentarian has said that they are not divisible. But it is important to note that even if you are impeached and removed from office, That's not necessarily the end of it, that you can still be indicted and tried and face judgment and punishment for crimes that are committed. Impeachment doesn't just mean that you now have a clean slate and you don't have to worry about being pursued in the criminal justice system. Section 4 talks about elections and scheduling elections and meetings of Congress. Congress used to start in March. Now for a new term of Congress begins in January. That's something that was changed with the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. We also know that the Constitution tells us that each of the House and the Senate can set up their own rules. And we know that the House and Senate operate much differently from each other. The House is a much more top-down, tall hierarchy, whereas the US Senate is a much flatter hierarchy, a much more egalitarian type of orientation to how members are treated and the power of individual members. In the House of Representatives, for a bill to get to the floor of the House of Representatives, it must first go through what's called the Rules Committee, very powerful committee in the House. The Rules Committee establishes a rule that then allows that bill to go to the floor of the House, and will then discuss the parameters in terms of the amount of time for debate on that bill. We'll discuss the amount of amendments and the types of amendments. All that goes into that rule that allows that bill to go to the floor. In the Senate, legislation goes to the floor of the Senate, not through a rule, but rather through what's called a UCA, which stands for a unanimous consent agreement. And in this unanimous consent agreement, essentially all members of the Senate agree in order to allow a bill to go to the floor of the Senate. Now that sounds like it's something that's difficult to accomplish, but it's really not that difficult. And it's not that difficult because of a process in Congress known as log rolling, kind of this quid pro quo. You allow my bill to go to the floor and I allow your bill to go to the floor. If I try and stop your bill from going to the floor, then you're probably going to try and stop my bill from going to the floor. So unanimous consent agreements are actually a lot easier to get in the Senate than you would normally think. But each House and Senate can set up their own rules for proceedings. Also, they can set up how they can punish their members. You can censure a member, but if you want to expel a member, it will take the concurrence of 2/3 of the members of that body. And this is a discussion that's currently going on with George Santos as he undergoes through his House ethics investigation. But there is a vehicle to expel a member from the House with a 2/3 vote. Each House, this House and the Senate, will maintain a journal of their proceedings. And if you ever watch C-SPAN, if you ever have time on your hands and you watch some of the debates on C-SPAN, you oftentimes see members get up there and ask permission to revise and extend their remarks. When they ask to revise and extend their remarks, they're basically saying, I only have like 30 seconds here to say what I want to say, but I've got a lot more I want to say. So I'm asking permission for everything I don't have time to say to go ahead and be able to put that information then into the congressional record. That's what they mean by revise and extend their remarks. And there are other things here, but again, we're just going to hit the very highlights. Compensation accrues for both members of the House and the Senate. The way in which they are compensated was changed by the 27th Amendment. And we will talk about the 27th Amendment as the most unique amendment process we've ever had. Originally, the 27th Amendment was proposed by James Madison. It was supposed to be part of the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights was supposed to have 11 amendments as opposed to 10 amendments. This one did not get ratified, and so it sat dormant for over 200 years and finally became part of the Constitution, the 27th Amendment, in 1992. We'll talk about that. It talks about how Congress can vary their compensation and having to wait until an intervening election in order to get an increase in their compensation. A really important part of Section 6 that's becoming more important with the investigation into January 6th is that last clause there in that first paragraph, that they shall in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace be privileged from arrest during the attendance at the session of their respective houses and in going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place. This is called the speech and debate clause. And former President Mike Pence is using the speech and debate clause to try and avoid testifying to the special counsel in the January 6th investigation. And so this is going to slow down the investigation, obviously. It's going to have to be adjudicated. It may actually be adjudicated all the way up to the Supreme Court. I think the important part of that passage in the speech and debate clause is that for any speech or debate in either house, they should not be questioned in any other place. So what you say on the floor of the House and the Senate, you cannot be prosecuted for, you cannot be investigated for what you say on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. So I think the former vice president has protection for what he said on January 6th within the chambers. I just don't know if that protection, the speech and debate clause, then extends beyond to what he talked about and what he said outside of the chambers on January 6th. So it'll be interesting to see what the courts say about that one. Then there's also this emoluments, and we became very familiar with this emoluments idea with former President Trump, but the emoluments clause also pertains to members of the House and the Senate. So an emolument is the ability for you to make money essentially from your public office, and you're not allowed to use your public office for private gain outside of the compensation that you get for serving in that office. Anything beyond that, that's considered to be an emolument. And so that's something that House and Senate members cannot benefit from those emoluments. President is not supposed to benefit from emoluments either, but we'll see that in Article number 2. In Section 7, all revenue bills must begin in the House of Representatives. All bills, before they can go to the president, must pass the House and the Senate in identical version. And the House and the Senate, with a 2/3 vote, can override a presidential veto. So we have all that there in Article 1, Section 7. In Article 1, Section 8, we lay out the specific powers of Congress. This is what we refer to as our enumerated powers. When you enumerate powers, you are inherently limiting powers because you're saying we are going to list the specific powers that Congress has. The implication there is if it's a power that has not been listed, that's a power that does not belong to Congress. That if we are explicitly saying this is a power Congress has, that means that if it's not listed there, that's a power that doesn't belong to Congress. This enumeration of powers is very much a nod to the anti-federalists, a nod to those who are concerned about creating too powerful of a Congress. So some of the enumerated powers that Congress has, they can lay and collect taxation. We know Congress has the ability to levy taxation. However, as we know earlier in Article 1, Congress could only levy taxation in apportionment to population, meaning that larger states would pay more in taxation than smaller states. So you may have some people tell you you don't have to pay your federal income tax because the direct federal income tax is unconstitutional according to the original Constitution. That is correct. However, it is not unconstitutional anymore because in 1913, we ratified the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which says Congress may levy taxation on any source whatsoever without apportionment. Congress has the ability to borrow money, and we're painfully aware of the ability of Congress to borrow money. We keep seeing the national debt increase and increase year after year after year. This next one is a really important one for federal government power and for the Federalists, the ability to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. This is your interstate commerce clause. When Congress increases its power over the states, historically, it oftentimes relies upon this commerce clause power, that it has the power to regulate commerce between the states. Now, that is also subject to Supreme Court scrutiny. And so the Supreme Court, in a series of cases over the years, has looked at this commerce clause. And the Supreme Court has said that in order for Congress to tell a state to do something under the Commerce Clause, whatever the issue is, it must have a direct connection to interstate commerce. That's a change from where the court was back in the 1800s to where the court is today. But this Commerce Clause is a major vehicle for the increase in congressional power. But again, remember our discussion of the Constitutional Convention, we said there's this economic imperative among delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And even the anti-federalists were concerned about getting their money repaid, getting their debts repaid. So they had an economic imperative for a stronger national government. This ability to regulate commerce is a direct artifact of that stronger imperative. Establish rules of naturalization, bankruptcies. To coin money, only Congress has the ability to coin money and affix the value of that money. To provide for punishment in counterfeiting securities and the coin of the United States, so punish counterfeiters, to establish post offices and postal roads. And so this is why we have a U.S. Postal Service, because this is one of the powers of Congress. Promote the progress of science and the useful arts. So we have a National Science Foundation that is being funded by Congress as that promotes useful arts. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. This means every federal court below the Supreme Court. So our federal district courts, our federal courts of appeal were all created by Congress in the Judiciary Act. Punish piracies and felonies. To declare war. Only Congress may declare war. Presidents can engage in military action, but if they want an actual declaration of war, they have to go before a joint session of Congress. To raise and support armies, again, here's our concern for the protection of national defense. To provide and maintain a navy, to regulate land and naval forces, calling forth militias, organizing and disciplining militias. And then we get to the last one. And this last paragraph in Article 1, Section 8 is known as the Elastic Clause. You've probably heard about this before, the elastic or the necessary and proper clause. To make all laws which should be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So anything that Congress needs to do in order to execute all these other powers that were enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, they have the power to do. This is a major nod to the Federalists, much to the chagrin of the Anti-Federalists. So we enumerate powers which limit the power of Congress to placate the Anti-Federalists, but then we provide this elastic clause to placate the Federalists that greatly expands the power of the Congress and the federal government. So we have these two competing aspects of Article 1, Section 8. Most all of Article 1, Section 8, which limits the power of Congress, and then this last paragraph, which greatly expands the power of Congress. So when Congress has exerted its power over state governments, historically it uses the Commerce Clause and this Elastic Clause. And those are the two clauses from Article 1, Section 8 that really help Congress expand its power in terms of federalism. Hold on. I got to remember to only use the arrow, because otherwise it just jumps around all over the place. Okay, let's go back down to Article 1, Section 9. So in Article 1, Section 8, we establish all these powers of Congress. Then Article 1, Section 9, we establish limitations on the powers of Congress. This first limitation here was a concession to slave states, that the slave trade could not be banned until at least the year 1808. So again, they punted the issue to a future generation. There's a very big concession that was given to slave states, and again, led us directly into the Civil War several decades later. Congress could not suspend the writ of habeas corpus. You're familiar with that. That means to present the body. And so if someone is arrested, we have to know, you have to say where they are, and you have to say what they're being charged with. So you cannot suspend that unless in cases of rebellion or insurrection or invasion. We did see Abraham Lincoln suspend writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, because clearly you were in a situation of rebellion. Congress may not pass any bills of attainder or ex post facto laws. A bill of attainder is essentially declaring someone guilty without a trial. So Congress can't say you're guilty of something until you first had the due process of a trial. Ex post facto laws and after the fact law. So you can't pass a law that if something was legal yesterday, you pass a law making it illegal today, and then you prosecute the person who did it yesterday when the law was not in effect. So you can't have those after the fact ex post facto laws. And then again, we have this requirement that you have to apportion taxation according to that 10-year enumeration of population. That was done away with, obviously, in 1913 with the 16th Amendment. Congress cannot give preference to one state over another. Congress cannot take money from the Treasury unless they appropriate those funds. And appropriation basically that means you say how you're going to spend the money, what the money is going to be spent on. That's why we have an appropriations process in the budget process for all of our discretionary spending. That is a constitutional requirement. That doesn't mean Congress hasn't found ways around it. They have, but technically everything must be appropriated before that money can be spent. And Congress cannot offer any titles of nobility, so you can't be a knight or can't be knighted by Congress. They're not allowed to do that. And then Article 1, Section 10, we then go and talk about limitations on the powers of states. And a lot of the limitations that we put on Congress, we then also put on states. And so states cannot have bills of attainder. They can't pass ex post facto laws. They can't grant titles of nobility. But then states also cannot enter into treaties. Now, we know that we kind of went through it quickly, but we know that in Article 1, that the Senate has the ability, and we'll see this again in Article 2, to provide advice and consent on treaties. And so whenever the president enters into a treaty, the president must then take that treaty to the Senate. The Senate then confers about that treaty and then must approve that treaty. States are not allowed to enter into treaties, alliances, or confederations. They're not allowed to coin money. They're not allowed to issue bills of credit. So very strict limitations placed upon some of the things that states cannot do. And there are other things as well, but those are some of the primary limitations on states. States do need to go to Congress if they want to, if you want to have a new state admitted to the Union, that has to go through Congress. If states want to join formal interstate compacts, agreements with each other, those formal interstate compacts also need to be approved by Congress. So Article 1 is all about the legislative branch, the powers of Congress, the organization of Congress, and some of the limitations of what Congress and the states cannot do. Again, it's the longest and it's the most detailed part of the Constitution. Today, we know that we have a House of Representatives that consists of 435 members. We have a U.S. Senate consists of 100 members. In California, we have a similar structure in that we have a bicameral state legislature. Our California State Assembly consists of 80 members, and our California State Senate consists of 40 members. So a major difference is that the size of our state legislature is obviously much smaller than the size of the two houses of Congress. Article 2 then turns its attention to the executive branch, and Article 2, Section 1 talks about the president, saying that the executive power will be vested in the president of the United States. Presidents serve 4-year terms. In order to be president, you have to be at least 35 years old, and you have to be elected through this electoral college process. Now, the way in which the electoral college works is much different today than how it was originally laid out in the Constitution. Under the original Constitution, the person who came in first in the electoral college became president. The person who came in second became vice president. Obviously, that meant that you could have a president and vice president who were opposing candidates from opposing political parties. We had that with Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Jefferson hated Aaron Burr. Jefferson decided to get that changed, and you ended up with the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, so that now presidents and vice presidents run together, and it's not who comes in first is president, who comes in second is vice president. But the Constitution establishes this electoral college. And you're probably familiar with the way in which the electoral college works today. 535 members of the electoral college. In order to be elected president, you must win at least 270. You have to get a majority of those electoral college votes. Each state has a share of the electoral college equal to the number of representatives they have in the House, plus 2 for their members of the Senate. California currently has the most electoral college votes, followed by states like Texas and then New York. And some states only have 3 electoral college votes. So they have 1 member of the House of Representatives and 2 senators. They end up with only 3 electoral college votes. District of Columbia also has 3 electoral college votes as well. That's why it's 538 instead of 535 votes in the electoral college. The way in which the process works today is that whenever you have the election in a given state, when you are voting in your election, you are voting not really for the candidate, but you're voting for their slate of electors. And every candidate will put forth their own slate of electors. The candidate that wins the popular vote will then have their slate of electors chosen as the certified electors. Those certified electors then meet in the state capitol in mid-December. They will then cast their votes. All those votes then get transported to Congress. Then they're opened in front of a joint session of Congress. And we saw this on January 6th. And the way in which it works is they're all open. The Vice President of the United States then reads the results. And if no one has a majority of the Electoral College for president, then the decision of president then gets shifted into the House of Representatives. So if no one wins a majority in electoral college, then it goes to the House of Representatives. Each congressional delegation in the House of Representatives gets one vote. So it doesn't matter if you're California or if you're Delaware. California gets one vote, Delaware gets one vote. And the House will then select the president. The US Senate then selects the vice president, and that's if no majority exists in the electoral college. That is a relatively unusual situation. Perhaps the most famous example of that was in 1824 with what came to be known as the corrupt bargain. And in 1824, you had John Quincy Adams, who was running against Andrew Jackson and several other candidates. And because we had many other candidates, it made it very difficult for anyone to get a majority of the electoral college vote. Andrew Jackson won a plurality of popular votes and a plurality in the electoral college, but fell short of an electoral college majority. And the reason for that is your third candidate, Henry Clay, had won some electoral votes. And so what happens, no one had a majority, so it then goes to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay work out a deal whereby Henry Clay will get his supporters to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams makes Henry Clay a cabinet member and makes him Secretary of State. So that happens. The House of Representatives selects John Quincy Adams, even though he got less popular and electoral votes than Andrew Jackson. And then John Quincy Adams became the president in 1824. That is why it came to be known as the corrupt bargain, perhaps our most famous example of no one getting a majority in the electoral college. But that's our electoral college system. Again, the electoral college system was established for two reasons. One reason was an inherent distrust in the decisions made by the general populace, but it was also a nod to the states and giving more of a role to the states in the selection of president, as opposed to if you just chose the president based upon popular vote. So it's very much a nod to the anti-federalists in states' rights. In order to be president, again, you have to be at least 35 years old and you have to be a natural born citizen. So in the House, you have to be 25 and a citizen for 7 years. In the Senate, you have to be at least 30 years old and you have to be a resident for a citizen for 9 years. In presidency, you have to be 35 and you have to be a natural born citizen and you have to have been a resident within the United States for at least 14 years. But you have to be a natural born citizen, someone born in the United States. We know that the president gets paid a salary and gets compensation, but there's also this emoluments clause that pertains to presidents, just like it pertains to members of the House and members of the Senate. Then there is a specific oath that all presidents must take. And I just mentioned this oath because there's an interesting situation in the Obama administration that during the Obama inauguration, Chief Justice Roberts screwed up the oath. And he got words out of order and didn't say the oath in the exact way in which it's written in the Constitution. Concerned about that, he then insisted that later on, he would come to the Oval Office and would re-administer the oath to President Obama. And he did that. And they met in the Oval Office, I believe it was maybe the next day, later that day or the next day, and re-administered the oath to make sure that he got it right, because the oath is actually within the Constitution. Then we get into, in Section 2, the powers of the president. The president, as we know, is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That was a big thing for the framers. You have a civilian in charge of the armed forces. They didn't want to have military juntas that would occur like they have seen happen in a lot of other nations around the world. They also made the president the chief executive, in that the president had the ability to require opinions of members of executive departments, which makes him the head of the executive branch, to grant reprieves and pardons. And we saw pardons were a major issue in the last administration, also a major issue in the Clinton administration as well, some very controversial pardons that were issued. We also know that the president has the ability to enter into treaties, but he enters into treaties with the advice consent of the Senate. This makes the president the chief of state as well as the chief diplomat for the nation. So you have to get the advice consent of the Senate. The president can also nominate members of the executive branch to fill up these positions in the federal bureaucracy, again, with the advice and consent of the Senate, again, making that the president the chief executive. The president, a lot of people don't know this, but the president also is what's considered to be the chief legislator, in that the Constitution also gives the president the ability to recommend legislation to Congress. And by recommending legislation to Congress, the president also plays this role of chief legislator as well. And then again, as chief executive, the president has the ability to fill vacancies. The Constitution talks about what are called recess appointments. And so presidents can make recess appointments. If Congress is in recess, they can appoint someone to that position, and that position would then be good through the end of the next congressional session. Those are called recess appointments. Presidents then have to give a State of the Union address, and we see that happening usually at the end of January for all presidents. We saw President Biden give his at the end of January as well, can convene Congress. And then Section 4 talks about this disqualification of the president, and this is something we argue about a lot because of the language used by the framers. President, Vice President, and all other civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. We have a pretty good sense of what treason is. We have a pretty good sense of what bribery is, but high crimes and misdemeanors is a very amorphous, very vague type of phrase. And so we argue a lot about, is this a high crime? Is this a misdemeanor? Essentially, what is a high crime or misdemeanor depends upon how the House of Representatives defines that in passing their articles of impeachment and the decision made by the Senate in that impeachment trial. So the actual empirical definition of high crimes and misdemeanors is left to Congress throughout the impeachment process. Article 3 is much shorter. It deals with the judicial branch, and honestly, it really just deals with one court, the Supreme Court. It establishes the Supreme Court, but doesn't include any qualifications to serve on the Supreme Court. There are no qualifications listed in Article 3 of the Constitution. It sets up jurisdiction for the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has original and appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction will be cases that go directly, immediately to the Supreme Court. Appellate jurisdiction, cases that get to the Supreme Court by moving through the federal judiciary first. 99.9999% of all cases that get to the Supreme Court get there through appellate as opposed to original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction would have to be a case that has momentous constitutional implications, whereby time is a factor, that it's something that needs to be decided immediately. That's something that would go to the Supreme Court because there's not enough time for it to go through trial courts. So not a whole lot in Article 3. All other courts in the federal judiciary were established by Congress in the Judiciary Act. So there you have your separation of powers, Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. In the state of California, we also have a similar separation of power system with a bicameral state legislature and a governor and a state court system as well. Article 4. In Article 4, we have this full faith and credit provision. Full faith and credit provision means that states must provide full faith and credit. They must respect the laws from other states. Again, this is a nod to the anti-federalists to say that states must respect other state laws, and so your laws are not going to go away just because you sign off on this new Constitution. All new states that are admitted to the Union must be admitted by Congress. And so a few years ago, we had this discussion in the state of California about breaking California up into 3 different states. Well, that's all well and good, but before that could actually happen, you'd have to petition Congress for those 3 states to be admitted to the Union, because only Congress can admit new states to the Union. Section 4 guarantees a Republican form of government to citizens of all of the states. And so every state is guaranteed a Republican form of government, which makes us this democratic republic. Now, a big flaw in the Articles of Confederation was the inability to amend the Articles. You needed to have a unanimous vote. We knew that was next to impossible, so in Amendment 5, we set up some specific ways in which we can amend the Constitution a bit easier. And Article 5 sets up 4 different ways to amend the Constitution. The first way to amend the Constitution is to have an amendment proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. That is the only approach we have ever used to amending the Constitution, because that is by far the safest approach. Proposal by 2/3 of the House and Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. However, there are 3 other ways in which it can be done as well. In the second way, an amendment can be proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate and then ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. The third way is that you can have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then amendments that emerge from that national constitutional convention can be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. And then the fourth way is to have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then amendments that come out of that constitutional convention then get ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. Now, obviously, once you start incorporating constitutional conventions into the discussion, it gets a little dicey in that you may end up with a runaway constitutional convention, kind of like we had the last time we did it, replaced the Articles of Confederation. So to be on the safe side, the cleanest and the easiest way to do it is amendment by amendment through using that first approach, having an amendment proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. Big thing out of Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause, a major nod to the Federalists. The Constitution, the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. So in other words, when state constitutions and laws come into conflict with the national constitution and national laws, the national government wins. This was a big concession for the Federalists that really scared the heck out of a lot of anti-Federalists. And this is one of the main reasons why we ended up immediately amending the Constitution 10 times in the Bill of Rights, and then seeing Hamilton and Madison and Jay write those 85 Federalist papers. But that is called the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. And then finally, ratification. Ratification is done by 9 out of 13 states. That happened relatively quickly. We had ratification by 10 states within 2 years. But as we discussed in our last class session, New York was the holdout. Because New York was the holdout, we had to then amend the Constitution with these 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. And then we end up with the Federalist Papers to again convince the citizens in New York to ratify this new Constitution. So 7 articles make up the original Constitution. Again, a series of compromises between slave states and non-slave states, large states and small states, and Federalists and Anti-Federalists. California Constitution, as we said before, has 35 articles and has been amended over 500 times. The primary reason why we've had so many amendments to the California Constitution is the initiative and referenda process. We talked about those last week as elements of a direct democracy. We don't have those same types of devices to amend the federal Constitution, but that's frequently and usually how we amend the California state Constitution. Another big difference is that for the federal Constitution, when we do amend the Constitution, we append those amendments at the end of the original Constitution. So 27 amendments are then appended to the end of the original US Constitution. In California, when we amend the Constitution, we literally actually amend the language within each one of those articles. So we don't append 500 amendments to the Constitution. We literally rewrite those articles based upon those constitutional amendments. So that's another big difference between the California state Constitution and the way in which the federal Constitution looks. So let's go through these amendments. I'll try and do this quickly. I know we're starting to run a little bit long with this discussion, but I'll do this quickly and then we'll take a break after we're done with these amendments. But we know we have 27 amendments to the Constitution. The first 10 amendments all come at once in the Bill of Rights. You're probably very, very familiar with the Bill of Rights and many of the amendments in the Bill of Rights. I'm sure you're very familiar with Amendment number 1. So Amendment number 1 talks about freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly and expression. There are some limitations, obviously, that the courts have added to some of these freedoms. So these are not considered absolute freedoms. But Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Let's stop there. That's freedom of religion. There are 2 different parts of freedom of religion. There's what's called the Establishment Clause and what's called the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause means believing what you want to believe, and that is pretty much unfettered. Congress cannot tell you what to believe in. You are free to believe anything that you want to believe in the Establishment Clause. Then there's the exercise of that religion. Now, in free exercise, there can be some limitations, and the courts have entertained limitations that have to do with public safety. So, if sacrifices are part of a religion, you can't go out in the middle of the street and conduct sacrifices because that has an impact upon public safety. Congress should make no law abridging freedom of speech. We know that there are some exceptions to that as well. Yelling fire in a crowded theater, anytime that it has an impact upon public safety, your speech may be able to be limited. Or freedom of the press. There are limitations there as well. A lot of those limitations end up being civil limitations in terms of publishing things that are untrue. We have libel and slander laws in this country, so a lot of those end up being civil types of limits, but there are some limitations in terms of what we can publish in the press. There's a concept in journalism known as prior restraint. Prior restraint is the ability of government to stop something from being published. There's very little power of the federal government to issue prior restraint. It's very difficult for government to stop the publication of something unless it has some really profound implications for national security. So we really try and avoid prior restraint in terms of dealing with the press in this country. And the right of people to peaceably assemble and petition government for a redress of grievances. We know that we have the ability to go out there, we have the ability to assemble, we have the ability to protest, but there are some limitations there as well. If our protesting has an impact upon public safety, we may be required to get a permit. That permit may limit the hours in which we can protest and the location of those protests. So there can be some public safety limitations added to right of assembly as well. Now, the Second Amendment. This is one that we argue about a lot in this country. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I will let you develop your own opinion. I'm sure you already have about the Second Amendment. But one of the things that we can do is we always try and divine the meaning of what the framers wrote in the Constitution. And sometimes it's actually easier than we would think it is, because the framers wrote other documents as well, where they were pretty clear about what they meant about some of the things they wrote in the Constitution. And some of those documents are those Federalist Papers. And so if you're interested in this whole idea of the Second Amendment and what Hamilton meant by a well-regulated militia, you can go and read Federalist Papers number 29 and 46. And in 29 and 46, Hamilton gets into some granular detail about what he means by a well-regulated militia. He talks about how many times per year this well-regulated militia would have to meet and organize to make sure they had adequate weaponry in order to be considered well-regulated. Hamilton didn't believe that they should be meeting every weekend or every month to drill, because he felt that the militia would be made up of citizens, and citizens would never be to the level of an actual soldier. They'll never get to that level, and so there's no reason to spend the time with these frequent practices, if you will, and drills. But they should meet at least once or twice a year in order to be considered to be well-regulated. So, Hamilton framers meant something by a well-regulated militia, and it wasn't there in the Second Amendment by accident. But again, Federalist Paper 29 and 46 will give you a lot more information about what the framers meant by a well-regulated militia. The Third Amendment we don't talk a whole lot about, and that's quartering of soldiers. No soldier shall in times of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. So this is a privacy right. And again, it's something that's not terribly germane to us today, but it is part of your umbrella of privacy rights as interpreted by the Supreme Court. Fourth Amendment limits search and seizure, and so you have to have warrants for search and seizure. We know that if the police are going to come in and search your house, they have to have a search warrant. That's your privacy protection there in the Fourth Amendment. No unwarrantable search and seizure. Fifth Amendment gets into some more of your criminal justice types of protections. In order to be tried for a crime, you have to be indicted by a grand jury. That's part of your constitutional protections. You also cannot be tried for the same crime twice. That's called double jeopardy. So you cannot be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. That double jeopardy protection is an interesting one in that originally the Supreme Court defined this double jeopardy protection to only be protection against the national government. and not protection against state government action. There's a famous case with a gentleman by the name of Palco. And Palco was tried for murder in the state of Connecticut, and he was acquitted. He was found not guilty. State of Connecticut was not happy with that decision, and so they retried him again, exact same crime, exact same evidence, exact same trial, and the second time had a different jury and ended up getting him convicted of murder. And he was then sentenced to death. Palco appealed to the Supreme Court in a case, Palco versus Connecticut in 1937, said to the Supreme Court, this is a violation of my double jeopardy protections in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Supreme Court said, we're sorry, but it's not, because this is only a protection against federal government action. It wasn't until 1968 in a case called Benton versus Maryland, where the Supreme Court extended these double jeopardy protections to include protections against state government action as well. The process of extending these protections from federal to state government is a process known as incorporation. And so whenever your rights get incorporated, it means that those protections, incorporation, it means that those protections now include protections against subnational governments and not just protections against the national government. That was 31 years later after the original Palco versus Connecticut case, so it certainly did Palco no good at that point in time, but that was an incorporation of the right to include protections against state governments. In addition to your protections against double jeopardy, you also have protections against self-incrimination. You cannot be made to be a witness against yourself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So if you're going to be deprived of life, liberty, or property, you must have due process of law given to you. You must get a trial. And you also can't have your private property taken for public use unless you are compensated for that property. This is the idea of eminent domain and just compensation for the government taking your property. Sixth Amendment continues your criminal justice protections, a right to a speedy trial. And again, you'll see in some of these cases, defendants may waive their right to a speedy trial, and then they may end up sitting in jail for a year or two, but you would have to waive that right if you didn't want to go to trial in a relatively quick fashion. Although this whole idea of speedy trial is something that is very much up in the air in a lot of our states because of limitations in terms of the amount of jurors that we're able to impanel, limitations in terms of the number of public defenders we're able to employ. Some cases recently in Riverside County got dismissed, and they got dismissed because they weren't able to proceed in a speedy way to the trial. So you have a right to a speedy trial. You have a right to be informed and of the accusations and confront witnesses against you. And so if someone is a witness against you in trial, you have the ability to confront that witness against you. Seventh Amendment is a jury trial in civil cases that are worth more than $20. So it kind of dates the Constitution in terms of the value of money. $20 isn't a whole lot today, but it certainly was a whole lot back in 1791. Eighth Amendment, prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bail. Cruel and unusual punishment, again, is something that the Supreme Court has dealt with in terms of capital punishment and whether or not it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. The Gregg versus Georgia case was a very famous case that sanctioned certain uses of capital punishment as not being cruel and unusual, allowing states to then start up their processes of capital punishment or restart their processes. Amendment 9, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Again, this is a nod to the anti-federalists along with all these other amendments to limit the power of the national government and say, again, this is a social contract whereby power comes from the people. And then the 10th Amendment, which is the Reserve Powers Amendment, the powers not given to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So again, those powers are enumerated powers in Article 1, Section A of the Constitution for Congress, and that if it's not listed in the Constitution, then it is reserved for state governments. In stark contrast to the elastic clause that we see at the end of Article 1, Section 8. And then just run through the rest of the amendments very quickly. The 11th Amendment limited the judicial power of the national government in terms of cases brought by a citizen of one state against another state. 12th Amendment then separated out, put the president and vice president together in terms of running together. So you no longer had whoever came in second would then become vice president. Again, that was at the behest of Thomas Jefferson and his utter hatred of Aaron Burr. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in 1865. 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, is your Equal Protection Amendment. That all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is an incorporation of those Fifth Amendment rights to include protections against the state governments as well. Equal protection, again, we have this one person, one vote type of idea, but again, we still had not included females in terms of the right to vote. That's something that would come later on through the women's suffrage movement. Then in the third section here, we have the limitation against people holding office if they participated in an insurrection or rebellion. Obviously, this was geared toward people who fought for the Confederacy, people who aided and abetted the Confederacy during the Civil War, to keep them from holding federal office unless Congress approved by a 2/3 vote to allow them to hold that federal office. This became a discussion point after January 6th, and you had some Democratic members of Congress saying that some of their Republican colleagues should not be allowed to hold federal office because they provided support and comfort to the insurrection on January 6th. 15th Amendment to the Constitution means that it removes race as a basis for denying votes. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote should not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment gives us the federal income tax, that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment. This is a huge grant of power to Congress, that Congress can tax anything, including a direct income tax on the individual income of individual citizens. That's where you get your federal income tax. 17th Amendment made senators elected by popular vote as opposed to being selected by state legislatures. 18th Amendment was prohibition. Finally, with the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, we get women's suffrage. 20th Amendment, we changed the terms of president and Congress to move them from March to beginning in January, because we had such a lag time between an election in November and March when they would begin office. We moved that up so they began office in January. 21st Amendment obviously repealed prohibition. 22nd Amendment establishes presidential term limits. And so we have a 2-term limitation for presidents. That obviously was in reaction to FDR and him being elected to 4 terms as president. Not that he finished his 4th one, but was elected 4 times to president. 23rd Amendment then gives us the 3 electoral votes for the District of Columbia, which gives us the 538 electoral votes instead of 535. 24th Amendment bars poll taxes, which were being used to deprive people the right to vote. Those become unconstitutional in the 24th Amendment. 25th Amendment lays out, after the assassination of President Kennedy, lays out more clearly presidential succession and how vice presidents then succeed into the presidency. So again, this lays out the vice president is first in line, followed by the Speaker of the House, then followed by the President Pro Tem of the Senate, then followed by cabinet secretaries by the date at which that department was established. So you go through the dates in which the departments were established, and the secretary of the oldest department then is next in line after the President Pro Tem, and then through the rest of your cabinet members. Now, this 25th Amendment became important at the end of former President Trump's term, in that it also talks about how a president can be deemed unable to carry out the duties of the office. And so what you would have is a vice president with a majority of members of the cabinet can declare a president unfit or unable to carry out the duties of office, and the vice president would then succeed the president. Or you can have a committee established by Congress that can do the same type of thing. Obviously, this is a very difficult process to go through, and it's oftentimes next to impossible to go through this process, because the president then can, once he is declared unfit to serve, can then petition Congress to say, yes, indeed, he is fit to serve. And then it's up to Congress to then make that decision about whether or not the president is fit to serve in office. But it gives us this vehicle for replacing presidents. And it's most useful, obviously, if you have a president like Woodrow Wilson, who suffers a stroke while in office. And it makes it a little clearer what you would do in that situation when the president would be physically unable to carry out the duties of the office. The 26th Amendment allows 18, 19, 20-year-olds the right to vote. And then the final amendment, the 27th Amendment, this really interesting situation where Madison first proposed this to be part of the Bill of Rights, then fell dormant because it didn't get 2/3 of the states to ratify it. I mean, three-quarters of the states to ratify it. So it sat dormant for 200 years. And then finally, in the 1970s, you had a student in the state of Texas who wrote a term paper saying this is still a viable amendment because there was no sunset provision. There's no provision in the amendment saying that after a certain number of years, it would be null and void like we have with amendments today. And so it was still a viable amendment. I think he got a C or C- on the paper, but undeterred went out and started a national movement to get the remaining state legislatures to ratify it, to get up to that 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify this and add it to the Constitution. And it finally happened and was ratified on May 7th, 1992, over 200 years after it was first proposed by James Madison. No law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. So if they want to raise their compensation, they cannot benefit from that increase in compensation until they stand for re-election. There must be an intervening election before that increase in compensation can take effect. So those are the 7 articles in the 27 amendments of the US Constitution. So what? So why do we spend this time? I was budgeting about an hour, and we spent about an hour and 10 minutes on it. But why do we spend this time on the Constitution? Well, number one, there's probably no other place in the program where you will cover the Constitution like this. So it's important you do this here in 500. And number two, we are required as public administrators to uphold the Constitution. That's one of our 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics. Upholding the Constitution and protecting individuals' constitutional rights is what gives us qualified good faith immunity. Under qualified good faith immunity, as an administrator, you are expected to know the rights of individuals and then endeavor not to violate those rights. So it's important that we know what's in the Constitution so we know what rights we are protecting when we are then dealing with citizens that we come into contact with in the course of our duties as administrators. So the federal Constitution is a pretty concise document, even with the 27th Amendment, 27 amendments is still a very concise document. The state of California Constitution is actually not only the longest Constitution in the entire country, but it could very well be the longest Constitution in the entire world currently. It is a very long, very detailed Constitution, a lot of specifics in the Constitution, and sometimes specifics in the Constitution that contradict other specifics in the Constitution. And that's because of the way in which we amend our Constitution in California. Because we have this initiative process, because we have these referenda, it is very possible that you could have a constitutional amendment in 1 year, and then 2 or 3 years later, another constitutional amendment passed by the voters that can come into conflict with that previous constitutional amendment. So the California Constitution is very lengthy and sometimes very self-contradictory, just because of the way in which we make those constitutions. But here in California, our Constitution comes from this direct democracy type of an approach, whereas at the federal level, there's a much more of a Republican type of approach to the way in which the Constitution is ratified and the Constitution is amended. Okay, it is 7:30. So that is our overview of the Constitution. You can digest some of that information. Let's take about a 15-minute break. Let's take a break until about 7:45. Come back at 7:45. We can field any questions or clarifications on the Constitution, and then we will move into a discussion of accountability and ethics and some of the ethical principles that we need to adhere to as we enforce this Constitution in dealing with our citizens. So take a break till 7:45. We'll come on back, and then we'll talk about accountability and ethics. Okay, welcome back. We had a good break. Again, I apologize for that protracted discussion of the Constitution, but it is the only time in the program you're really going to have a chance to take a look at it. And so I thought it was important that we go through all the different elements of the Constitution so we know what we're enforcing and what we are defending as public administrators. But as public administrators, we are not only protecting the rights of our individual citizens, but we're also protecting public taxpayer money. And we're trying to do it in the most efficient way possible, in the most effective way possible. And so one of our main topics that we're going to discuss in the remainder of our class is this idea of accountability and ethics in the public sector. And as I mentioned to you before, we are a NASPA accredited program, and coincidentally or not coincidentally, this is the week of our site visit from NASPA. And so actually our site visit team arrives tomorrow evening, and then they will be on campus all day on Wednesday and Thursday morning to do their site visit for our next 7-year reaccreditation. And so it's kind of nice for me now because I used to be department chair. And so the last 2 reaccreditations, I was department chair. And so I had to kind of take the site visit team around and write the self-study and do all that. Now, Dr. Butts has the responsibility of doing that as our department chair. So now I get to just kind of sit back and participate in a few meetings throughout the remainder of the week, but not actually lead the process. But NASPA requires that every program has some coverage of ethics and accountability. And that's becoming more and more important, obviously, with each passing year, with all these news stories about misuse, malfeasance, and misfeasance of public taxpayer money and using public offices for private gain. And so it's become very, very important for public administrators to know what accountability is and know how to hold themselves and each other accountable for their actions. So the way in which we've decided to do it in our program is to sprinkle a coverage of ethics and accountability throughout all of our core courses. And so you get it here in 500, you'll get it again in budgeting, you'll get it in HR, you'll get it in org theory, you'll get it in policy, and obviously you'll get it in research methods. And that's been the choice that we have made. Every few years, we go back and we revisit that choice, and we talk about adding a standalone required course in ethics to the core curriculum. But that would lead us to a 42 unit as opposed to a 39 unit program. And we've decided that we'll keep the program streamlined at 39 units and just sprinkle accountability and ethics throughout the entire core curriculum. So this is kind of your first entry into this idea of accountability and ethics in the MPA program. So we're just going to kind of get the tip of the iceberg and not get into a lot of the specifics that you'll cover in future courses, but just talk about what is accountability, why accountability is difficult, some of the different approaches to accountability, and some of the ways in which we can make accountability a little bit easier for us to ensure in the public sector. So I think we all have a pretty good sense of what accountability is. Accountability is a relationship between people and things. And so it's a relationship between administrators and money, between administrators and their employees, between administrators and their organizations, between administrators and their clients and their stakeholders and their citizens. So it's a relationship between people and things that they are interacting with. Accountability is really the bedrock foundation of bureaucracy because it allows our policymakers to hold administrators accountable for their actions. And so if we look at this in your very basic politics administration type of dichotomy, a la Woodrow Wilson that you'll read in another couple of weeks, where we have the political side and the administrative side of the equation. On the political side, we have elected officials who are making decisions and passing legislation and laws. And then on the administrative side, we have the administrators, the objective administrators, who are implementing these policies and these laws that have been promulgated by the elected officials, the decision makers. So elected officials have oversight over administrators to hold them accountable to make sure they're implementing these policies and programs in the way in which they are supposed to be implemented. So it really is that bedrock of public administration and bureaucratic organizations. The problem, though, is that it really has a negative association because when people think about accountability and holding people accountable for their actions, it has a very negative type of association to it in that it's about uncovering problems. It's about seeing problems, seeing mistakes, and seeing intentional mistakes that people are making And it's something that oftentimes elected officials really like to try and keep their distance from. Because if elected officials uncover these accountability issues, then they are going to be oftentimes held accountable themselves, and that they should have known that this was going on. And so oftentimes elected officials try to keep accountability at an arm's length and don't really want to know what's going on the administrative side of the equation, because they don't want it to come back and hurt their reelection prospects. But we certainly do need accountability mechanisms to make sure that public taxpayer money is being spent in the way in which it's supposed to be spent, that we are doing things in a legally appropriate manner. But we also have to balance those accountability measurements with getting the job done and getting the job done well. Sometimes too much accountability and too many accountability regulations will impede our effectiveness and our efficiency as public administrators. We need, as public administrators, to have the flexibility to take creative approaches and be innovative without worrying about running afoul of some rule or some regulations, so that we can meet the needs of our citizens and our consumers, if you will. Sometimes having too many accountability measures will make it difficult for us to attract the best and the brightest into the public service. So what are the approaches to accountability? Well, if we back it up to Woodrow Wilson, his study of administration all the way back into the 1880s, the first approach to accountability was what we call the legal boundaries approach. In the legal boundaries approach, we connected accountability to the politics administration dichotomy. We said elected officials make the laws, they make the policies on the political side, and then administrators carry those policies out. If we saw administrators dabbling in politics, then we would say they're doing something that's outside of the scope of their duties. And so we would hold administrators accountable for administering and implementing those programs and not engaging in playing politics with this politics administration dichotomy. There's a very legal boundaries. There's a legal boundary between the political side and the administrative side. Very quickly, though, within a few decades, we realized that that wasn't true. And we realized that was not realistic, because we know that public administrators are also involved in policy formulation. They are asked to participate in the formulation of policies. They are asked to write the rules and regulations that will guide the implementation of these policies and these programs. So in the political challenges approach, beginning in the 1930s, we recognize that there are indeed political roles for administrators to play. And so it was impossible just in a very straightforward way to say, well, this administrator is playing politics, and so therefore this administrator is being unethical. It really questioned our ability to, in a top-down way, have external controls, external accountability controls that are placed upon administrators, because every administrator is probably being involved in some part of policy formulation. So we realized the politics administration dichotomy was not a true dichotomy. And so therefore it wasn't that helpful in allowing us to identify ethical versus unethical type of behavior. Today, it's really more of an it depends type of approach, in that we realize that the politics administration dichotomy is not really that much of a dichotomy after all. And we also realize that every organization is different. Every organization has its own different, unique organization culture. And so it's not as easy as just having these top-down rules that apply to everyone in every organization in every situation. We can no longer have that type of a hierarchical chain of command in the enforcement of accountability and ethics. There is no single professional norm for every agency and every individual in every agency. We have to really model our ethical expectations based upon the expectations within each one of those unique organization cultures. So every organization develops its own culture, and the accountability mechanisms that we then apply to hold our administrators accountable for their actions must be in accordance and must match those unique organization cultures and the norms and the values and the expectations within each one of those unique organization cultures. So it's not a very straightforward and easy way in which we can apply accountability and hold people accountable for their behavior. But when we do try and hold them accountable for their behavior, we can hold them accountable in a variety of different ways. One type of accountability is fiscal accountability. And this is the one that's most widespread, that we think about the most when we think about ethical adherence and holding people accountable. It's concerned with whether agency officials are spending money on the programs that they are charged with managing, and only spending money on those programs. So how are they spending public taxpayer money? And are they spending this public taxpayer money in the legally appropriate ways, the legally mandated appropriate manner? So if they have restricted funds that are only meant to be spent on this type of a program or this type of expenditure, and they're taking that money and spending it someplace else, obviously that's going to be a problem for fiscal accountability. A check on fiscal accountability can obviously be things like financial and legal audits. And so most of our agencies and most of our programs must be subject to financial, or what we call legal audits, whereby we will audit the books and make sure the money is going where the money is supposed to be going. As government organizations, especially if you're in a special purpose type of government, a school district or a regional water district, you're probably going to have a lot of restricted funds, money that's coming from the federal government or from the state government that must be spent on specific types of programs. And so I think we had mentioned before, in the world of education, things like Title I, II, III, and IV spending that comes from the federal government. Those funds are restricted and must be spent on prescribed types of expenditures. Holding people accountable to make sure they're spending the money in the way in which they're supposed to, that's fiscal accountability. And that's what we think about most when we think about accountability. But then a second accountability is what we call process accountability. That's concerned with how agencies are actually performing their tasks, how they are actually implementing these policies and these programs. So when we get into process accountability, we're really looking at implementation, and we're looking at things like efficiency. Are we getting more with less? Are we producing more outcomes with and more outputs with fewer resources? So process accountability holds people accountable for efficiently spending this money. We assume that they are spending it in the legally appropriate manner. They have achieved fiscal accountability, but how efficiently are they spending the money? Are they wasting taxpayer money? And then there's program accountability. Program accountability looks at the results, the outcomes of the program. And so throughout the MPA program, you're probably in a lot of your classes going to talk about this difference between outputs and outcomes. An output is the actual product or the service that's being created by this agency and by these administrators. The outcome is the consequence of that product or that service. So how that product or that service is impacting the lives of people who are consuming and benefiting from that product or that service. This is where we get into effectiveness. So process accountability is more about efficiency. Fiscal accountability is more about legality. Program accountability is more about effectiveness. So are we achieving our purposes with the way in which we're implementing these programs and these policies? Are they achieving their stated outcomes, their goals, their objectives, the consequences that we want to try and achieve? So we can hold administrators accountable for spending in the right areas, for how efficiently they're spending the money, and then for the results that they are getting from making the spending decisions that they are making. So lots of different ways in which we can measure accountability. It's not just one monolithic term. It really depends upon what aspect of accountability we are looking at and why we are holding people accountable for the actions that they are taking. So the solution we have found to accountability and to enhancing ethical adherence is to find that balance between our rules and regulations that are placed externally onto these agencies and these administrators, and balancing that with ethical training for our administrators, with the code of ethics within our organizations, and with hiring people who really have this public service ethos, that really have the character to be public servants. So it's both the balance between external rules and regulations and internal to the organization, the actual character and training of those public administrators themselves. But the best way that we can get this balance is we need information. When there are accountability issues, when there are problems with ethical adherence, we need to know that. We need to generate that information. The problem is that these issues with ethical adherence, these ethical violations, are occurring within the organization. And so if you are an overseer and you're trying to implement these rules and regulation, these codes of ethics, and you're trying to place these on the organization, you don't really know what's going on in the organization on a daily basis. If you don't know that a problem exists, it's going to be difficult for you to address that problem. So what we need to do in order to achieve this balance between external roles and internal training and characteristics in the organization is by empowering what we call our whistleblowers. I'm sure you're familiar with whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are those members of the organization who see an issue and bring that issue to light. Whistleblowers, when they do see an issue going on in their organization, they can bring that to light at the federal level by going through the Office of Special Counsel. And in 1978, we had this major overhaul of civil service rules and regulations. And as part of that major Civil Service Reform Act in 1978, we established a thing called the Office of Special Counsel. And the Office of Special Counsel was designed to be a forum through which whistleblowers could identify ethical issues within their organization and then bring those ethical issues to the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel would then investigate those issues in a very kind of quasi-judicial type of approach, investigate those issues, and then if those issues were true and they find evidence for those issues, then the Office of Special Counsel could then issue corrections to those agencies in order to try and resolve those types of ethical issues. So it's really the whistleblowers within our organizations that we need to empower and protect. And so we then, in 1989, got this thing called a Whistleblowers Protection Act. And the Whistleblowers Protection Act, we greatly expanded the budget of the Office of Special Counsel, and we pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of what was called the Merit Systems Protection Board, and we made the Office of Special Counsel its own standalone organization with its own budget and with its own staff. By doing so, we then allowed these whistleblowers who have a venue through which they can take their claims to the Office of Special Counsel to have them adjudicated. Whistleblowers within organizations really kind of have two choices they can make. Whenever they see these problems in their organization, they see these ethical violations, they can become the voice. And when they become the voice, it means that they take these issues to the Office of Special Counsel. They blow the whistle and they draw attention to these ethical violations. The other approach they can take is they can exit. They can just leave the organization, go to another organization, hopefully another organization that does not have those same types of issues, those same types of problems. But by providing protection to whistleblowers, we can allow them the comfort of becoming the voice in pointing these problems out. So also the Whistleblower Protection Act, not only did we pull the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit Systems Protection Board, but we also made it a crime to retaliate and have retribution against whistleblowers. We protected whistleblowers for blowing the whistle, and providing those types of protections are elemental to giving the comfort and the flexibility for those whistleblowers so that they can feel free to bring forth these issues without the concern of losing their job or demotion or losing some of the perks that they have accumulated within that organization. So in the public sector, since we are dealing with public sector taxpayer money, since we are dealing directly with citizens and public programs that citizens are oftentimes legally entitled to the benefits of, we are held to higher ethical standards than oftentimes our counterparts in the private sector. These higher ethical standards in the public sector sometimes will lead to this shock of ethical upgrade, whereby people will come from the private sector into the public sector, and they'll be shocked by all the scrutiny and the fishbowl effect and all these ethical rules and regulations. And so much so that sometimes they leave the public sector and go back to the private sector. It is more challenging because of all these rules and regulations we need to adhere to and the transparency of the public sector. It is challenging for public sector employees to do their job. And it becomes challenging for us to attract people into the public sector. Attracting people into the public sector means, again, achieving this balance. We need to be able to hire the most skilled administrators, but we still need to make sure that they are held to the highest accountability standards to preserve the public interest. The article that you read for this week, the Bennington and Moore article, talks about public value. And it's actually a conclusion, an excerpt from their book on public value. And the argument that Moore and Bennington make is that whenever the public sector gets involved in the provision and or production of goods and services, by getting involved in provision and production, there's a good chance that they are displacing private sector resources. But the private sector resources that would normally be used for the provision and production of this good or service will be displaced with the public sector getting involved. So when the public sector gets involved, it must provide a higher value than the value of those displaced private sector resources. So you must provide some value to what you are doing in the public sector. And that value really comes in terms of preserving the public interest. So again, it's all about this balance between holding people accountable while at the same time freeing them up so that they can be creative and innovative and add value to what they are doing in achieving the interest of the public. Sometimes that's more difficult to do when you have administrations that do not believe in the value of the public sector and do not believe in the value of government. There's a very famous book from 1970 by a man named Charles Goodsell. And, sorry about that. Charles Goodsell, I'll put that in text chat. And it's called The Case for the Bureaucracy. And in Goodsell's Case for the Bureaucracy, he makes an argument that the bureaucracy is held in very low esteem by the public. It's held in low esteem by the public because the public have had some type of negative interaction with a bureaucratic organization. So it is incumbent upon public administrators to show the public how important the work of government is and to show them how the work being done by this agency is vital to the everyday life of that citizen. And if you can do that and become an advocate for what you are doing as an agency and become an advocate for the public sector, we can all help turn around this negative attitude that people have toward government and to the bureaucracy. In the George H.W. Bush administration, he tried to do this by calling government service the highest and noblest calling that anyone could have. Barack Obama, in his 2008 campaign, said his goal was to make government and public service cool again. And so we've had some administrations that have tried to build this favorable approach. The Clinton administration, in their reinvention of government, talked about the problem with the federal bureaucracy is not the people, it's not the administrators, it is the system itself. And so by kind of building this public support or trying to build this public support for the public sector, you can encourage people, despite the complications of working the public sector, you can encourage people to join the public sector because public administration can be this fulfilling vocation and has the potential to impact the lives of many and to make a difference in our communities. That's very difficult to do, though, when you sometimes have administrations that have a very negative view of the bureaucracy. In our previous administration, the previous administration had a negative view of the federal government, wanted to eliminate departments, wanted to with their, I forget what the schedule is called, but schedule whatever, the initiative to be able to remove career civil service protections and get rid of career civil servants for reasons other than cost. That sometimes makes it difficult for us to then attract people into the public sector because the work of the public sector is complicated enough to begin with, that if you then remove these positive view of the public sector, you're not going to be able to get the best and brightest. If you don't get the best and brightest in the public sector, you're clearly not going to be contributing that public value that Bennington and Moore talk about in their article and in their book. So we need to find this balance between accountability standards, ethical standards, and then freeing people up to be creative and to be able to be effective and efficient in the jobs that they are doing. So some of those external types of guidance and some of those external rules and regulations that we have to hold administrators accountable will differ depending upon organization and profession. One of the unique aspects of public administration is you have people entering public administration from a variety of different professional backgrounds, which is different than a lot of other fields. In history, you have historians. In education, you usually have teachers. But here in public administration, we have political scientists, and we have sociologists, and we have psychologists, and we have engineers, and we have criminologists, and we have social workers, and we have people coming from a variety of different professions. Every profession will have its own unique code of conduct and code of expectations. What that means is that for some members of the public service, they will have multiple competing codes of conduct and ethical standards that they are held accountable for. But for all of us, despite the professional backgrounds we come from, we are all public administrators. So the one common code of conduct that we all have as public administrators is a code of conduct from the American Society for Public Administration. So the American Society for Public Administration, or ASPA, their code of conduct is comprised of 8 different ethical principles. The first ethical principle, as you can see on your screen, is to advance the public interest, to promote the interests of the public and put service to the public above service to oneself. This is serving the public before serving yourself. Public interest above private interest. This was a major problem that we had in the 1800s during an era of employment known as the era of spoils. In the era of spoils, public administrators got their job not based upon who they were or based upon what they knew. They got their job based upon who they knew. They got their job based upon the political party or the candidate that they supported in the last election. If that political party won the election, then to the victor go the spoils. And they were then given a position to thank them as a reward for supporting this candidate or this party. When that happens, obviously you have people there who oftentimes don't have the qualifications to do the job, but they're also there to make private gain. They're there to use their public office for private gain. And there's a very famous book from a member of a political machine in New York City called Tammany Hall. As you know, in the 1800s, a lot of our major cities were run by these political machines. And in New York City, the political machine that ran New York City was called Tammany Hall. And there's a gentleman who worked in Tammany Hall named George Washington Plunkett. And George Washington Plunkett wrote a book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And actually it was ghost written for him, but it was his recollections of working in Tammany Hall. And in Plunkett of Tammany Hall, he talks about some of his approaches to being a public servant in Tammany Hall. And in one part of the book, he refers to as honest versus dishonest graft. Now, when you think about the word graft, we usually think about corruption. Graft is corruption, corruption is bad, period, end of story. He referred to honest and dishonest graft, or honest and dishonest corruption. He said there is an honest type of corruption, and he describes a situation of honest corruption. He says, honest graft or honest corruption, in this situation, let's say that I am working for the city, and I get wind of the fact that the city is going to buy up some land in order to convert it into a public park. So based on that information, I then go and I buy that land first, and then I turn around and I sell it to the city at a big increase. And I make myself a lot of money by selling that land to the city. Because based upon the information I got in my public position, I knew the city was going to buy it. I knew the city really needed this land. And so I made some money by buying it first and then reselling it to the city. He said that is an example of honest corruption. As he likes to say, I seen my opportunities and I took them. That's what he considered to be honest work in Tammany Hall. That is clearly, by our standards today, unethical, because that is using your public position and information you have gleaned through your public position to enhance yourself in terms of private gain. That's putting private interests above public interests. That's something we need to avoid in principle number 1 in the ASPA Code of Conduct. Second principle, uphold the Constitution and the law. Respect and support government constitutions and laws while seeking to improve laws and policies to promote the public good. This is why we spent the first half of the class tonight talking about the US Constitution and then alluding to the California Constitution, because we have this requirement in the ASPA Code of Conduct to uphold the Constitution, both federal as well as state. Number third principle, to promote democratic participation. Inform the public and encourage active engagement in governance. Be open, transparent, and responsive, and respect and assist all persons in their dealing with public organizations. We want to promote democratic participation. We want to make it easier for people to interact with their public organizations, with public agencies, and with elected officials. Now, promoting this democratic participation and making it easier for people to interact with your organization is a double-edged sword. Obviously, there's a good aspect to helping people to find that avenue of participation. The downside, obviously, is if you do that, then you got people having much more contact with the organization. Problems that they are running into then become your problems as a public administrator. But that's something we need to deal with, because we need to show people how they can participate in their own governance and encourage them to participate in their own governance. Morton Grodzins called our system of government a multiple crack theory. He said there are multiple cracks whereby people can participate in their own governance. We as public administrators must facilitate that use of those cracks by those individual citizens. Number four, strengthen social equity. Social equity is now a major value that underpins the field of public administration. To treat all persons with fairness, justice, and equality, and respect individual differences, rights, and freedoms. Promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality in society. This is what a lot of public administration scholars will refer to as active administrators. That administrators must actively promote social equity within their organizations. Social equity, the addition of social equity as a value of public administration, dates back to H. George Frederickson and the new public administration movement of about 30 years ago. So it's a relatively new value in public administration, but it's a value of public administration that has really received increased emphasis over the past 3 to 4 decades. Number five principle, to fully inform and advise. To provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members, and to staff members in your organization. So we have to provide the information necessary to allow those elected officials the information they need in order to oversee what we are doing within our organizations. Now, sometimes this fully inform and advise principle can be difficult. And it can be difficult because of what's known as the principal-agent relationship. And we may have mentioned this in our last class, but the principal-agent relationship. Text yet. And the principal-agent relationship, we have a principal and we have an agent. The principal is the overseer. So the principal is the one that is charged with the duty of overseeing the actions of the agent. In our example, the principal would be Congress or members of a state legislature or a state legislative committee that oversees the bureaucracy. The agent would obviously be the agency and the public administrators within that agency. Now, in a principal-agent relationship, you would normally think the principal has the information they need to oversee the actions of the agent. What we know is that there is what we call information asymmetry, in that there is an asymmetric relationship in terms of information between principals and agents. And again, I'm typing and talking, so if I misspell something in text here, I apologize, but information asymmetry. Whereas the agent has more information than the principal. The agency knows what's going on a daily basis. The administrators within the agency are implementing these policies and programs on a daily basis, so they know what is going on. The overseers, the principals, they're remote from the agency, so they don't necessarily know what's going on a daily basis. So this information asymmetry then creates this phenomenon known as a moral hazard for the administrator. The administrator has more information than the principal. The administrator then needs to decide what information and how much information to provide to that overseer that will then allow that overseer to scrutinize the agent's actions more closely. The moral hazard is obviously the more information you give, the more scrutiny you'll have to endure. But our principle number 5 says that we need to fully inform and advise. We need to provide that accurate, honest, and comprehensive and timely information to those who are overseeing the actions of our agencies and the jobs that we are doing on a daily basis. We have to overcome this moral hazard by fully informing and advising. The 6th principle is to demonstrate personal integrity, to adhere to the highest standards of conduct, to inspire public confidence and trust in the public service. By doing this, obviously, we can then build rapport and build trust with the public in what we are doing in the public sector, and trust then breeds trust in the future with other organizations as well. That can then help turn around this negative view of the bureaucracy that Goodsell talks about in his book. Number 7, promote ethical organizations who strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. And then number 8, to advance professional excellence, strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically, and encourage the professional development of others. So encouraging the development of others within our organization, mentoring newer employees who enter into our organization, providing professional development opportunities for employees in our organization to help them develop their skills, to then assist with succession planning within our organizations, another principle of the ASPA Code of Conduct. So these 8 principles are the 8 principles that are common to all public administrators, irrespective of what profession they come into public administration from. The problem is when you have other professional codes of conduct that may come into conflict with these 8 principles from the American Society for Public Administration. But these are the 8 principles that we all share as public administrators. It's important that you are introduced to these 8 principles here in the 500 class. You will return to them again in future courses as you talk about ethics, but it's important that we all have a clear basic understanding of what these 8 principles are as we enter into a program that studies public administration. So those are the 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics. Here in California, our approach to accountability and ensuring ethical adherence is oftentimes accomplished through transparency. California has some of the strictest transparency laws of any state in the country. And we really believe here in California that if we can open up the doors of governance and we can let the sun shine in, that type of transparency and scrutiny will then help us achieve high ethical standards and high adherence levels to those ethical standards. So some of the ways in California that we try and achieve those high levels of transparency, and there are a lot of them, but just, for our purposes tonight, you're probably very familiar with something called the Brown Act. The Brown Act is our open meeting legislation. And the Brown Act says that meetings must be conducted in public, that anytime you have a majority of a board or a city council or supervisors or a decision-making body, as long as there is a majority of those in attendance, that is considered to be a meeting. And those types of meetings must be conducted in public. They must be conducted in public with the opportunity for public comment. Now, with these public meetings, we oftentimes have open and closed sessions. So there are some issues that can be considered by this governing board in closed session. So things such as if you have conversations with your legal counsel about pending or anticipated litigation, that can be done in closed session or executive session outside of the purview of the public. However, there are very strict requirements for how those issues can be discussed in closed session. If you're having discussions with your legal counsel must be present, or at least through teleconference. You cannot discuss pending litigation unless you actually have your counsel present in those closed session meetings. In terms of things like some things like personnel decisions, and so if there are any types of sanctions or firings, discipline that needs to happen, those discussions can occur in closed session. Then they get reported out to open session, not with names, but rather with employee numbers to protect the privacy of those employees. So there are safety types of discussions. When I was on a school board, and we had discussions about specific safety modifications we were making to school facilities, those discussions obviously were done in closed session because you don't want to have those discussions in open session and basically tell people some of the vulnerabilities that exist in your facilities. Public comment, as I said, the public needs to have the opportunity to comment on agenda and non-agenda items. Agendas must be published at least 72 hours in advance in a public place. If you have a member who's attending from a remote location, that has to be in the agenda, and then you have to put notifications up wherever that member is attending the meeting from. I've had a couple of occasions where I've been out of town or out of state, and so I've had to participate in the meeting from my hotel room, and so I would have to put a sign up, literally keep my hotel room door open, put a sign up on the hotel room door saying, this is the meeting, I'm participating in the meeting, members of the public are allowed to attend this meeting. The hotel manager would then have to put the sign up on the front door of the hotel saying that the meeting is taking place and you can participate in this room. You really have to do all that under the Brown Act, because it's all about transparency and letting the sunshine in for the public to see the work of government. We also have public records requests. They're kind of similar to FOIA requests at the federal level, but here in California, they're public records requests. Any member of the public can request public records, and then the governing organization, the governing agency, then has 10 days to respond to these public records requests. So whenever you put in a public records request, you can say, I would like to see all the correspondence that has gone on in this city dealing with the issue of the granting of this permit for this development. And then the city would have 10 days to collect all the correspondence and all the information about any discussions that have occurred regarding the issuing of that permit, and then make that information available to that requesting member of the public. This includes not just emails and paper documents. This also includes if cell phones have been used for text messages that have dealt with this issue that's within the jurisdiction's purview, then those text messages are also then discoverable. And so that's why a lot of public officials will have two separate phones. They'll have a private phone, and then they'll have a phone that's used only for the conducting of public business. So that's, again, a transparency type of requirement. If you're in a reportable position, I don't know how many people are in reportable positions, but if you're in a reportable position here in California, you have to complete a conflict of interest form, which is known as a Form 700. And in that conflict of interest form, you then have to report out any potential conflicts of interest that you may have with your role that you are playing in that elected position or that appointed or that administrative position. So if you own property outside of just your primary residence within that jurisdiction, that needs to be reported. If you have sources of income that you are getting from employers within that jurisdiction, those sources of income would have to be reported so that we at least know of any potential conflicts of interest that may exist in doing your job on a daily basis. So again, a lot of these transparency requirements in the state of California, much more so than we oftentimes see in a lot of other states. And those are all meant to try and enhance ethical adherence and to enhance accountability. So accountability in the public sector is really all about striking this balance. We have to strike a balance between external controls and the internal training of the employees within our organizations. We also have to strike a balance between holding people accountable, but yet still freeing them up so that they can make good decisions and that they can make decisions that benefit the public interest, decisions that will create this public value, as Bennington and Moore discuss in their article and in their book. So it's important that we find that balance between ethical adherence and effectiveness. Because we can find that balance between ethical adherence and effectiveness, that's how we meet the demands of the public, and that's how we contribute to Bennington and Moore's public value in public administration. So in terms of accountability and ethics, I think that one of the best ways to really communicate a lot of this information is to put it in tangible, practical terms where we can really see the nexus between a lot of the theoretical approaches we've talked about with accountability and ethics, and then how accountability and ethics can actually be done on a daily basis within our public organizations. So let's do some breakout groups now. And for our breakout groups, what I'd like to do is I'll put you randomly in breakout groups. So again, you'll be able to meet and work with some, hopefully different folks than you worked with last week in your breakout group. And I'll just try and do it all randomly. And in your breakout groups, each group should try and discuss instances from your organizations that involved a lack of ethical adherence. So some instances of ethical dilemmas or ethical problems that you have seen within organizations. Now, you can keep this very anonymous because I know that this could be a little sensitive. So you don't have to identify, certainly don't identify any people by name who are involved in these ethical dilemmas. You don't have to identify the organization that was involved in this ethical dilemma. But as a group, based upon your individual experiences, just discuss some of those ethical dilemmas that you have run into in the course of your career as a public administrator. And then what I want each group to do is, based upon that discussion, each group should then select one example of an ethical dilemma that was discussed by the group, and then share that ethical dilemma with the class, highlighting which of the principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics were potentially violated in that example. And as we go into our breakout groups, I'll put that slide up again with those 8 principles that you can refer to. But which of those ASPA Code of Conduct principles were violated with this ethical dilemma that you're discussing? As always, select one spokesperson. That spokesperson can share the example with the rest of the class. But again, you can keep it anonymous, no names, no identifiers, but we've all run into these ethical dilemmas before in the public sector. And I think by sharing one of them, each group sharing one of them with the class, it really can help us find this nexus between some of these theories we've talked about and approaches we've talked about tonight, and how we can actually apply them to resolve some of those ethical dilemmas in the public sector. So let me go ahead. Let's see, we have 23. So we'll go with our 4 groups again. I think that worked pretty well last time. So let me assign the groups randomly. Okay, I've got the groups assigned. So let me then go back through our slides. I'll put up our 8 principles here. I'll go ahead and open up the groups. Let's see, it's 8:32. Let's try and do this if we can in about 20 minutes if possible. And then that will give us some time to reconvene, see what each group came up with their examples, and then hopefully get you out of here a little bit after 9 o'clock tonight. So, my philosophy is once we go past 3 hours, things kind of fall apart a little bit. So we'll try and do all this in about 20 minutes and then reconvene as a class. So I've got our 4 groups set up. I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms, and then you can go and join your room, and then I'll check in and let you know we have 5 minutes left and we have 1 minute left, and then we'll reconvene as a class. Sound good? Any questions? Okay, let me go ahead and open up the rooms, and then you can have at it. And I think we still have some groups that are closing up, so we'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we should be closed. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, I think all the groups are closed up. So let's go ahead and share out what you came up with your example, and then which of the principles in the code of conduct you believe were violated by that ethical dilemma. So let's start with room number 1.
Hello, I'll be the spokesperson for room number 1. So on this ethical dilemma is more so something that was contemplated and not necessarily carried out. We did have a few examples that were carried out, but ultimately decided to go with this one. What would apply is on number 6 on demonstrate personal integrity. So in particular, I work in urban planning, and so we process construction development projects. An applicant came in, and that applicant is their name is Prologis, and they're one of the Um, they own some of the most real estate, industrial real estate in the country. And they came in with two projects at the same time, projects of over 500,000 square feet in development. And the project manager for those projects was also describing that they were throughout the country coming out with these types of projects. So one of my first thoughts that I had was, I wonder what their stock looks like now and what it'll look like in the future. And I contemplated buying, not to an extreme extent, but briefly contemplated on buying some of that stock. But I quickly thought to myself that would be a conflict of interest, and that I would be in violation of integrity, or I'd have to recuse myself of working on that project if I did that. So ultimately, I decided not to do that and continued on with working on the project.
Thank you, Alfonso. That's a great example, and I'm glad you certainly made the decision you made. Congress, this is a major issue in Congress all the time, is that members of Congress, they pass legislation, and then that legislation has an impact upon some industry or some sector, and then they go out and they buy stock in that sector, or if they're passing some type of regulation that may hurt the price of stock, they may go out there and they may dump their stock. And we've seen that happen with members of Congress, and it's really unfortunate because those members of Congress are using public information, or the information they're getting in their public position, for private gain. And so there have been some calls in Congress to make sure that all members of Congress put all their stock into a blind trust, and so they have no idea what stocks they have, and so therefore that type of conflict of interest could be completely, if not done away with, at least minimized. So that's a great example, and that's a very important example that goes on in Congress almost on a daily basis. So excellent, thank you very much. Okay, group number 2.
Okay, so I'll take over for group number 2, and my example, I'll be very vague because, like you said, it's like people still work for the organization that I work at, but essentially, I want to say maybe sometime in the probably during 2022, we had a director of a department at the city I work for who there was just an insane amount of turnover with not only part-time staff, but also full-time staff that worked under this director. And it was over a long period of time where a ton of people, and I want to say it was upwards of 15 over the course of a year, that quit. And for the most part, because it was a department that physically is very close to my department. So a lot of, there's a lot of communication between the employees, between the two departments. And it was pretty much all directly related to the director that oversaw that department. And like I said, it was such a huge amount of turnover in such a short period of time. And from kind of an employee standpoint, it didn't really seem like there was anything done in that regard. Through the grapevine, there was talk of they'd had a talk with that person and then they dealt with it. But ultimately, that director is still in their position. And at this point, they've pretty much, I think, fully staffed now, all those positions that were open over the course of that time. So it's almost like we have an entirely new department that is over there now because they had to replace everybody. And we kind of talked about, it came up in our discussions of that's why certain HR departments do exit interviews, because they want to gather data on why people are leaving an organization. And I know from personally talking to people that have left after seeing them at community events later, they did have very frank exit interviews with HR in regards to why they were leaving and directly relating it back to that director. So we kind of talked about that. I don't know if it's something where the director had a really good relationship with the city manager and was probably doing a very good job in every other aspect of their position, and that's why that they have continued to maintain their position there. But it does obviously cause a lot of conflict on the employee level where, everyone talks and you have kind of questions about why decisions are being made and why people are kept on. And so it'll be interesting. We have a new city manager now, so I don't know. And like I said, there is an entirely new crop of employees almost essentially from a year ago. So it'll be interesting to see if that person did have a talking to and things change moving forward, or if under a new city manager, they won't be able to kind of maintain that status quo of keeping that position and letting turnover keep happening. So I think in our discussion about that, we kind of connected it back to a couple of those, the code of conduct ethics. Number one, advancing public interest. So obviously, if you have staff that are not happy and fulfilled in their jobs, they're not going to be doing as high a level of work, and therefore the public will suffer because you're not providing the highest level of service. Number 8, advancing professional excellence. Obviously, a director level especially is in like that's a huge part of their job, not only just like getting the department to function, but doing it well and making sure your employees are, developing and there's like kind of a clear, path forward and moving up through your department. And then also, I think we talked about number 5, fully inform and advise. So kind of questions about whether or not that director is fully informing the city manager of how things are going in their department versus what the actual kind of realistic feeling is at the bottom level. So that's what we talked about in our breakout room.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And yeah, I think 1, 5, and 8 make a lot of sense. And the one that jumped out at me initially was number 8. It led me to wonder, because is this manager just, not providing the type of training and the type of opportunities, and that's why people are jumping to other organizations. And just imagine the amount of money that if you're losing so many positions, you have to bring all these new people in, you have to onboard them, you have to train them. It's an immense undertaking in terms of resources, and I hate to say wasted resources, but resources you wouldn't have to otherwise spend. And it will be interesting with the new city manager to see, because if that person is gone or if that person gets reassigned, then it was that relationship between the former city manager and that manager. So excellent, very good, thank you, and good connection those 3. I agree with those. Good. Thanks, Amanda. Okay, group number 3.
All right, hi everyone. I'll be taking the lead for group number 3. Between the 6 of us, we talked about how we work in a combination of public agencies as well as nonprofit agencies as well. And a lot of us continue to work with vendors, external vendors that support our programs and our projects. And we felt that in certain circumstances, when we've gone out to RFP or we've put out a bid for a certain vendor to work on a project, sometimes a particular vendor is preferred over the others, and that could be through a multiple different reasons. It could be long-standing service with that particular vendor, the quality of service they're going to bring. And another point was brought up, if you're on a short timeline or a short deadline, let's say a 2-month, 3-month deadline, and you need to get a project done ASAP, you would feel more comfortable going with someone who knows your agency, knows the work that you need, and you will tend to default with them, even though they may not be, maybe the most cost effective or X, Y, and Z. So we felt that it touched on at least item number 6, which is demonstrating personal integrity, adhering to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in public service. And it's not that we're being deceitful to our agency or our public. We ultimately believe that certain vendors can bring more bang to the buck if we select them. So it's not coming out of like a malintent or a malicious, background, but it can at times be impractical to select one vendor or give, special treatment to one versus the other. It's not fair across the board. But again, it all comes from a good place. So that's what we wanted to share.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, it is good that it's coming from a good place. You're trying to benefit the public, and you think that this is a vendor that can do a good job, and your experience with this vendor, and they've done good work in the past, and so it's not necessarily you're creating private gain out of anything like that. It's just there's someone who's easy to work with, and more comfortable working with them. And sometimes especially in the competitive bidding process now, you can do some pre-qualifications, and through pre-qualifications you can identify some of those vendors, and then when projects come up, you can select those pre-qualified vendors. And sometimes that's a way to work with vendors and with contractors you're comfortable with, without violating ethical rules. But I think you're right; it's coming from a good place. So it's no type of malfeasance that's going on, but it could be concerning, especially if it's a competitive bidding type of situation.
Absolutely.
Good. Thank you, Chris. Well done. And group number 4.
Hey everyone. So mine kind of goes, we had a great discussion in our group. We found out all government's corrupt and we're Debbie Downers because of this, just the use of it all. So that was fun, really ended on a high note. But our discussion, or one of our points, was actually really similar to Chris's, except kind of in more of a questionable manner. So I work for the building department. I'm a permit technician. So I see a lot of the developments that come through. And in a previous city I worked for, there was this development that had been going on for a couple of years. It was for a senior living building, not too big when it comes to commercials, like 10,000 square feet. But the contractor was a lower tier. So they'd been dragging their feet, really drawing it out. And I came to find out later when I was working with the city that the contractor's son, or no, the mayor's son was one of the contractors for that team. And there were other things that the mayor had done, and kind of like Chris had highlighted, you know, there's probably other decisions that went into this. Maybe their quotes came in lower, but it really made the question kind of start to be begged to be asked of how much of that, number one, the advancing the public interest versus kind of the nepotism, the advancing oneself, the private interest was kind of weighed out in that decision making, because the project still continued on even after I left that city. I was with that city for about 2 years. So it's one thing where I was kind of sharing with the group. I've had plenty of jobs where I worked for my family, and I'm wholeheartedly on board with having that opportunity. If your father or a relative has that and they bring you on, awesome. I think it needs to be weighed out very carefully in the public sector, because obviously those are private sector items. Because in the public sector, it's not just a betterment of your child, you know, it's also the public who is going to be at fault if they have to kind of stare at an eyesore of a building that has never really taken off, and it's just kind of dragging. Now it's kind of bleeding into everyone else's life.
Yeah, great example. And that reminds me of an example, a similar example where there's a government that was going out to bid for the construction of a new high school. It's a school district. And before they went out to bid, you know, everyone knew that this new high school was going to be built. And so one of the board members, his nephew, wanted to start a construction company. And so he basically started this construction company for the entire purpose of being able to build this high school. And so they went into competitive bidding, but the board member gave an indication to his nephew's new company that, you know, this bid will probably get the job done, you know, if you come at this price. So he came at that price. It was a lot lower than all the other bids, and so therefore he got the bid. And then through change orders, the actual cost of the school ended up being almost triple what the initial bid was. And he just increased it through those change orders. And yeah, that's a loophole that they got around. And is it ethical? Obviously not. And I think just like in the example you used, you know, number one is the one that's really being violated in that example. So good. Yep. I've seen it happen. So it does happen. Okay. Thank you, Aiden. Very well done. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I think those are great examples. I think you connect them back to the code of conduct very well. This is a code of conduct that you're going to be using then for your next Canvas essay. So you'll be selecting 3 of these that you feel may be difficult for you or difficult for your organization to implement, and why they may be difficult. I think in our discussion of those 8, I kind of clued you into some of them, like the fully informed and advised, and some that are across the board kind of more difficult to implement than others. But pick 3 that you think may be difficult for either your position or for your organization, and why those may be difficult. Very good. Okay. I hope that you got to work with some other cohort members tonight through the randomization. So next week we'll do breakout groups again, and we'll hopefully get some more randomization, get to meet and work with some other members of your cohort. For next week, what we will do is we're going to talk primarily about differences between public and private sector organizations. And we're going to start laying that foundation for the study of public administration. So we'll lay the foundation for why we study public administration differently than we study private organizations. And we'll start building that with this discussion of public and private differences. The article from the classics text that you really should pay attention to for next week is that Graham Allison article. We will reference the Graham Allison article a great bit in class. And then you'll also be using the Graham Allison article in the your next upcoming Canvas essay. I think it's number 3. So if you read Graham Allison, we'll talk about public-private differences next week. Then do remember, please submit your initial skill self-assessment and your second Canvas essay by the 12th. Okay? Sound good? All right, thank you. I'm sorry I kept you a little bit later than usual, but I hope you Hope this was useful information. Hope you have a good week, and then we'll talk again for week 3 then on Monday night. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
everyone.
Talk to you next week.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.